Malachi is the last prophet in the Old Testament. I always say this, he's not the last Old Testament prophet, because the last Old Testament prophet was who? John the Baptist. He was the last Old Testament prophet. But he didn't write in the Old Testament, he wrote in the New. But Malachi is the last prophet of the Old Testament. It's written in the Old Testament. And from Malachi to John the Baptist, there was nothing. They did not hear from God. A lot of things happened in that time, and as I said, maybe in the next couple of weeks we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that happened to shape the events and shape the things that were, in Jesus' day. But they had not heard from God. They had not had a prophet. They had not had anybody speaking the word of God. They had their religion that we're going to read about here. They had the priests. They functioned in, under the law of Moses, because if you remember, a couple weeks ago, Jairus was here and he was talking about Nehemiah and Ezra, and when they got back into this city and rebuilt the city, rebuilt the temple, they had a time where they read the law to all the people. So they had the Old Testament, they had the Torah, the Pentateuch, they had the writings of the Old Testament that had existed up to that time, the words of the prophets. They had that on the outside. They had a temple. They rebuilt a temple. They didn't have the ark. That had disappeared, and there's been a lot of conjecture as to where the Ark of the Covenant, if it does still exist, where it is. Some people say it's buried under Jerusalem. Some say it's in Ethiopia. We don't know, and it really doesn't matter. As far as spiritually, it doesn't matter. But they were doing religion. They were doing the Jewish religion as they were taught. And at the time of Malachi, or the time after the temple had been built and the city had been rebuilt, they reestablished the Levitical worship. And they vowed, the people, one thing that the Jewish nation never did again, they never fell into the kind of idolatry that got them in trouble in the first place. Because if you go back to the Old Testament, to before the captivity in Babylon, they worshipped other gods. They sacrificed their children to the gods, Chemosh and Molech, and they intermarried with the people that God told them not to do. They were disobedient. They were stiff-necked. They were stubborn. So when they came back to Jerusalem, and God allowed them to come back after 70 years of captivity, and Cyrus sent them back, they were very zealous about keeping the law. And what was happening here in Malachi were the roots and the foundations of what we would, in the New Testament, we read about the Pharisees. The Pharisees, that word Pharisee comes from a word that means separate. And they were very, very adamant about keeping the law. When Paul talked about when he was a Pharisee, he said, as touching the law, I was blameless. Well, the Pharisees had their roots here in some of what we're reading here in Malachi. They were really formed during the time of the Maccabean revolt, and that's in between the Testaments. But they had their roots back here. They determined that they would never again allow themselves to get back into what had happened. They were not going to worship idols. They were going to honor the Sabbath. That's why in Jesus' day there was such an emphasis on Sabbath keeping, because one of the things that God was angry with them, they did not honor his Sabbaths. They did not honor his holy days. So there was a movement in the Jewish people at the time among the priests of holiness, of being living according to the law, and that's good. That's good. But when you start to exchange external performance for internal commitment, then what happens is your relationship becomes religion. And what was happening in Malachi's day is that they had reestablished, they had the external trappings of Judaism, but yet they had grown apart from God, and we're going to read that as we read chapter 1 here in Malachi.